I still remember standing frozen in that hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to keep from falling. My son-in-law's voice came through the crack in the door, calm and calculated, like he was closing a business deal. Except the person he was dealing with was my daughter. And what I didn't know yet was that somewhere in that house, a 9-year-old girl had already been keeping record of everything, because children always know. I still remember the exact moment my body stopped moving on its own. I was standing in the hallway of my daughter's house, one hand pressed flat against the wall, the other clutching my phone so tightly I could feel the edges cutting into my palm. The house smelled like pot roast and fresh laundry, the way it always did on Sunday afternoons. Wind chimes clinked softly outside the kitchen window. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. But something was wrong. I knew it, the way you know a storm is coming before a single cloud appears. You just feel it in the air. Earlier that afternoon, I had driven the 20 minutes from my place in Midtown Sacramento to their neighborhood on the east side, the kind of quiet, tree-lined street where every lawn was trimmed to the same height and every mailbox matched. The kind of street where nothing bad was supposed to happen. I had a casserole dish in my back seat and absolutely no reason to worry. Or so I thought. My daughter Claire met me at the door before I even knocked. She had always been like that, tuned in to the sound of my car, pulling into the driveway since she was about 12 years old. But the woman who opened that door didn't look like someone who had been watching for me. She looked like someone who had been waiting for something else entirely. Her eyes were tired in a way that a good night's sleep couldn't fix, and when she smiled, it reached her mouth but stopped right there. "Mom, you didn't have to bring anything," she said, taking the dish from my hands before I could even step inside. "I wanted to," I told her. And then, because I couldn't help myself, "How are you doing, sweetheart? Really?" She was already walking toward the kitchen. "I'm great," she said, a little too quickly. "Everything's great." Her husband, Marcus, came around the corner just then, and if Claire looked like she was carrying something heavy, he looked like a man who had never lifted anything difficult in his life. He was polished, the way only certain people learn to be, the kind of polish that takes years of practice. Firm handshake, easy smile, the right amount of eye contact. "Clara," he said warmly, though my name is Ruth. He had been calling me Clara for 6 years, and I had never once corrected him. What a nice surprise. "Just dropping off dinner," I said. "You're too good to us." He said it the way people say things. They don't mean smoothly, automatically, like a recording. We sat in the living room for a while, the three of us, while their daughter Lily sat at the far end of the couch with a book open in her lap. She was 9 years old and sharp as a tack, the kind of child who absorbed everything around her without appearing to pay attention. But that afternoon, she wasn't reading. She was watching her mother, quietly, carefully, the way a child watches something they don't fully understand, but know enough to be worried about. I noticed Claire apologize 3 times in the first hour. Once, when the ice in Marcus's glass melted too fast. Once, when Lily knocked over a cup of juice. Once, for something I still can't quite identify, just a small, reflexive "I'm sorry" that floated up out of nowhere in the middle of a sentence. Marcus never apologized for anything. I stayed longer than I planned, and when I finally stood to leave, I reached for my phone and realized it wasn't in my pocket. I checked my purse, checked the couch cushions, and then remembered I'd set it on the kitchen counter when I walked in. "I'll just grab it," I said, and headed down the hallway. That's when I heard him. Marcus was on the back patio, just outside the kitchen door. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been caught off guard. I slowed, without meaning to, pressing my back against the wall just inside the doorway. "It's already in motion," he said. "She signed off on the first set of documents last month. Didn't even read them." A pause. "That's the thing about trust. Once you have it, you can do almost anything with it." My hand found my phone on the counter. My thumb found the record button. I don't know what made me do it. Some instinct older than logic, some part of me that understood even then that whatever I was hearing, I needed to be able to prove it. His voice dropped lower, and I caught only pieces after that. Something about a timeline, something about an evaluation, and then clear as anything, by the time anyone figures it out, it'll already be done. I heard him shift the scrape of a patio chair, and I moved quickly back toward the living room phone in hand, heart going faster than it had any right to. I said my goodbyes on autopilot, hugged Claire a little too long, kissed the top of Lily's head, shook Marcus's hand, and looked right into his eyes, and smiled like I hadn't heard a single word. The walk to my car felt like the longest 20 feet of my life. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, both hands in my lap, staring at the phone resting against my knee. The recording app was still open. The timer showed 43 seconds. I didn't press play, not yet, because some part of me understood that once I listened to it, really listened, whatever was happening inside that house was going to become my problem to solve. And I wasn't ready, not yet. But I also knew sitting in that quiet car, on that perfect, peaceful street, that not listening wasn't really an option either. The drive home felt longer than it should have. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the sky had turned that deep purple gray that Sacramento gets on Sunday evenings in late summer, the kind of color that makes everything feel both beautiful and a little melancholy at the same time. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never touched, the steam rising and curling and disappearing into nothing. And I stared at my phone like it was something I'd found washed up on a shore. I pressed play at 9:47 that night. The first time through, I barely breathed. Marcus's voice came through the small speaker, low, and controlled the way it always was. But hearing it stripped of his face, his smile all that careful charm, it sounded different, colder somehow. The second time I listened with a pen in my hand, I wrote down every word I could make out. Most of it was fragments, half sentences, swallowed by the sound of wind and distance. But certain phrases came through clearly enough that I underlined them twice. Cognitive evaluation. I set the pen down and looked at those two words for a long moment. I had spent enough years working alongside social workers and family advocates before I retired to know what those words meant in a legal context. A cognitive evaluation wasn't just a doctor's appointment. It was documentation. It was a paper trail. It was the kind of thing that got referenced in courtrooms. I pressed play again. Prenup modifications. That one landed differently. Claire and Marcus had signed a prenuptial agreement before their wedding, something Marcus had insisted on, and Claire had agreed to without much discussion. I remembered how casually she had mentioned it at the time, like it was just paperwork, just a formality. I hadn't pushed. I wished sitting there in my quiet kitchen that I had pushed. The third time I listened, I wasn't hearing the words anymore. I was hearing the tone, the complete, unhurried certainty of a man who had already accounted for every variable. A man who wasn't worried about being wrong because he had made sure there was no way to be wrong. That's when the memories started coming back. Small things I had tucked away without meaning to. The way Claire had stopped mentioning her friends from work, just gradually, the way a photograph fades rather than disappears all at once. The phone calls that used to last an hour and now ended in 10 minutes, always with some quiet excuse. The birthday dinner 2 springs ago, where she had reached for the checkout of habit, and Marcus had covered her hand with his gently smiling at the table, and she had let him take it without a word. At the time, I had thought nothing of any of it. People grow, marriages shift, life gets busy in ways that are hard to explain from the outside. But now, sitting with those underlined words in front of me, all those small moments arranged themselves into something that looked a lot less like coincidence. I picked up the phone and called the one person I trusted completely when it came to anything legal. Anything that required both a clear head and a willingness to hear something hard. Patricia had been my closest friend for 35 years. Before she retired, she had spent 2 decades as a family law attorney, and she had seen more of what people were capable of behind closed doors than most people ever wanted to know. She answered on the second ring. "It's late," she said, but her voice wasn't annoyed. She could hear something in mine. "I know," I said. "I need to tell you something." I told her everything. The dinner, the way Claire had looked, the recording, the words I had written down. I read them to her slowly, the way she asked me to. When I finished, the line was quiet for long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Patricia," I said. "I'm here," she said. "I'm thinking." Another pause. Then carefully. "Ruth, what you're describing isn't just a husband being controlling. Those two phrases together, the evaluation and the modifications, that's a legal strategy. Someone has thought this through." The coffee in front of me had gone completely cold. "You mean he's planning something?" I said. "I mean, he may already be several steps into it," she replied. We talked for another 20 minutes, but by the time we hung up, the shape of what I was dealing with had changed entirely. This wasn't a bad feeling anymore. This wasn't just a mother's instinct misfiring. This was something real, something that had been quietly building inside that beautiful house on that tree-lined street, probably for longer than I wanted to think about. I walked to the fireplace mantel and stood in front of the framed photograph I kept there. Claire and Lily at the coast, 2 summers ago, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame, hair blown sideways by the ocean wind. Claire looked like herself in that photo. Fully, completely herself. I looked at it for a long time. I didn't know yet what the next step was. I didn't have a plan, didn't have anything close to one. But I knew one thing with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones and doesn't move. Whatever was happening to my daughter, I was not going to stand at the edge of it and watch. 2 days was about as long as I could wait. I called Claire Tuesday morning around 8:15, right after I knew Marcus would have left for the hospital. He kept a strict schedule early rounds on weekdays, which meant there was usually a window between 8 and noon when the house belonged to her alone. I told her I had been in her neighborhood, picking up a few things, and asked if she wanted company for a bit. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. I had been in my car since 7:30, parked 2 streets over, working up the nerve to make that call. She said yes before I finished the sentence. When she opened the front door, she was already dressed, hair done, a light cardigan over her work clothes, even though she wasn't scheduled at the pharmacy until afternoon. There was something almost performative about it, like she'd been expecting to be observed and had prepared accordingly. She smiled the same smile from Sunday, the one that lived only in the lower half of her face. "You really didn't have to come all the way out here," she said. "I wanted to," I told her. Same words as Sunday, same meaning. This time, I meant them even more. Inside the house stopped me in a way it hadn't before. I don't know what I had been expecting, some visible sign of disorder, something out of place. But it was the opposite that unsettled me. Everything was immaculate. Not clean the way a home gets when someone tidies up before company. Clean the way a space gets when the person living in it has learned to be very, very careful. Every surface wiped, every pillow squared, the kitchen counter bare, except for a single fruit bowl positioned exactly in the center. I have been in enough homes over the years to know the difference between order and control. We sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea she made, without asking how I took mine, because she already knew. And for a while, we talked about easy things. The weather turning, a television program we both liked, whether Lily's new teacher was going to be a good fit. And then gently, I steered us somewhere else. "You look tired, sweetheart," I said. Not an accusation, just an opening. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been having some trouble sleeping," she said. "It's nothing serious. I've actually been on some medication for it, just to take the edge off." She said it the way people say things they've been coached to say. Smoothly, briefly, with a small, dismissive wave of the hand that was meant to close the subject before it fully opened. I nodded slowly. "Is it helping? Some days more than others," she said. Then she looked out the window. I let a moment pass before I tried again. "Have you had a lot on your plate lately? Besides work, I mean." Something shifted in her expression, barely perceptible, the way a curtain moves in a room where no window is open. "There's just been a lot of paperwork," she said carefully. Marcus has been handling most of our financial planning, updating accounts, adjusting some things. I've signed off on a few documents recently. She paused. More than a few, actually. Do you understand what you signed? I asked, keeping my voice light conversational. She looked at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something real move through her eyes. Not quite worry, something quieter than that. Something that had been sitting with her for a while. Marcus explained it all, she said. He's very thorough. Another pause, smaller this time. He's been so patient with me lately, honestly. I don't know what I'd do without him walking me through things. There it was. Not the words themselves, which on the surface sounded like gratitude. It was the way she said them. Careful, rehearsed. The way you repeat something back to yourself, often enough that it starts to feel like your own thought. I was about to say something, I'm not sure what, when I heard the soft pad of footsteps coming down the hallway. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her school uniform backpack, already on lunchbox in hand. She looked at her mother first, the way she always did, that quiet, watchful assessment that I had noticed on Sunday and couldn't quite name. Then she turned and looked at me. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, but in those 4 seconds, my granddaughter looked at me with the eyes of someone who had been waiting a very long time for the right person to notice something. There was no panic in it, no dramatic plea, just a steady, knowing look that said more than a 9-year-old should ever have to say without words. Then, she turned, called out a goodbye to her mother, and walked out the front door to catch her bus. Claire watched her go with a soft smile. She's so independent, she said fondly. She is, I agreed. But I sat with that look the entire drive home. It followed me through the front door, through the afternoon, into the evening. I couldn't shake it, and I didn't try to, because that was the moment, the last small piece of doubt I had been holding on to finally let go. Something was happening inside that house. My daughter couldn't fully see it yet, but somehow, impossibly, her 9-year-old already could. And if Lily could see it, then I had no more excuses not to. There are things you can push to the back of your mind, and things that won't go. I tried that Tuesday evening and most of Wednesday morning. I made a grocery list. I watered my plants. I watched half of a documentary about national parks and retained nothing. Because underneath all of it, quiet and persistent as a low hum you can't locate, was the image of my granddaughter standing in that kitchen doorway, looking at me like she had been holding something too heavy for too long and was finally carefully setting it down. I had spent 30 years keeping financial records for a living, and if that career taught me anything, it was this: when something doesn't add up on the surface, you don't ignore it. You go looking for the source. By Wednesday afternoon, I was in my car. Claire had worked part-time at a compounding pharmacy on Folsom Boulevard for several years before Marcus had encouraged her to cut back her hours. She had mentioned it casually at the time, framing it as her own decision, but I remembered thinking it seemed unlike her. Claire had always loved that job. She was good at it, the kind of pharmacist who actually talked to her patients, who knew their names and their histories, and noticed when something seemed off. There was one person there I knew she had been close to, a woman named Sandra, who had worked alongside Claire for the better part of a decade. Sandra was a few years younger than me, thorough and straightforward, the kind of professional who took her responsibilities seriously enough that I trusted her before I even walked through the door. I found her restocking a shelf near the back of the pharmacy when I came in, and I kept my voice low and my manner as calm as I could manage. I explained that I was Claire's mother, that I had some concerns about her health, that I wasn't asking Sandra to do anything that crossed a line, only to help me understand something if she could. Sandra looked at me for a long moment before she said anything, the kind of look that takes a person's measure quietly and carefully. "Give me a few minutes," she said finally. I waited near the consultation window while she stepped into the back. I looked at the rows of neatly labeled bottles behind the counter and thought about my daughter reaching for one every morning, trusting that it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Sandra returned with the printed record, an expression that told me something before she spoke a single word. She kept her voice low, professional, her eyes moving briefly to the front of the store before settling back on me. I'm going to speak generally, she said, because that's the appropriate thing to do, but I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I nodded. The prescription your daughter has been filling here, she said carefully, falls into a category of medication that affects the central nervous system. The class is commonly used for anxiety and sleep, which is what it appears to be prescribed for. She paused. But the dosage progression over the past several months is not what I would consider a standard treatment pattern. What do you mean by progression? I asked. I mean it has increased, she said. Incrementally. Consistently. Every 4 to 6 weeks, a small adjustment upward. She set the paper on the counter between us and tapped it once with her fingertip. A physician would understand exactly what a sustained increase like this does to a person over time, to their ability to concentrate, to retain information, to trust their own memory. The fluorescent lights above us hummed steadily. Somewhere near the front, a register beeped. Are you saying this is unusual? I asked. Sandra chose her next words the way someone chooses their footing on uncertain ground. I'm saying that a dosage pattern like this, in the absence of a documented escalation in symptoms, would raise questions for me professionally. She looked at me directly. The kind of questions I would want answered before continuing to fill it. I thanked her. I kept my voice steady and my hands flat on the counter, and I thanked her the way you thank someone when you are working very hard not to fall apart in a public place. The drive back to my car took about 45 seconds. I know, because I counted each step without meaning to, the way your brain sometimes finds something small to hold on to when everything larger feels like it's moving too fast. I sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine. Outside, the afternoon traffic on Folsom moved along in its ordinary way. People running errands, picking up prescriptions, going about the business of their Wednesday, in complete and total ignorance of what I had just learned. I had come here thinking I might find something that would ease my mind, that Sandra would look at the records and tell me it was nothing unusual, that I was a worried mother reading too much into too little. Instead, what I found was a pattern, deliberate, incremental, designed by someone who understood precisely what they were doing and exactly how long it would take. My daughter had been trusting the man she married with her health, her mind, her sense of herself. And somewhere along the way, without ever feeling a single, sharp moment of alarm, she had started to drift. I had been afraid before, worried, uneasy, unsettled in ways I couldn't fully name. But sitting in that car on that ordinary Wednesday afternoon, I felt something different move through me, colder than worry, sharper than fear. This was not about paperwork anymore. This was about Claire. The call came Thursday morning, while I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee I actually managed to drink. Patricia's voice had a particular quality when she had been thinking hard about something overnight. Measured, deliberate, like she was choosing each word the way you choose your step on a trail you haven't walked before. I had known her long enough to recognize it immediately. I made some calls yesterday, she said. There's someone I want you to meet. His name was James Kowalski. Patricia had worked with him years ago during her time in family law, back when she still took the kind of cases that required someone with a background in investigation to help gather what attorneys couldn't access on their own. He was former law enforcement, she told me, retired after more than 2 decades, and he had spent the last several years doing private work, quiet work, the kind that required patience and discretion in equal measure. We agreed to meet that same afternoon at a small coffee shop on J Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and exposed brick walls and enough ambient noise that a conversation could stay private without anyone having to lower their voice too dramatically. James was already there when I arrived. He was a solidly built man in his late 50s, the kind of person whose stillness reads as competence rather than disinterest. He had the unhurried quality of someone who had spent a long career learning that rushing rarely produced anything useful. He stood when I approached the table, shook my hand once, and waited for me to sit before he did. Patricia tells me you have a situation, he said. I do, I said. And then I told him everything. I had told the story twice before, once to Patricia and once to myself in the dark of my kitchen But this time felt different. James didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly to any particular detail. He simply listened, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes steady, absorbing everything I gave him, the way a good listener absorbs things completely, without letting any of it show on the surface. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Walk me back through the financial piece," he said. "The documents your daughter mentioned signing, the account adjustments." I repeated what Claire had told me as precisely as I could remember it. He nodded slowly, asking a clarifying question here and there. Nothing dramatic, just small, precise questions that told me he already had a framework in mind and was fitting my answers into it. "What you're describing," he said finally, "isn't unusual in its individual parts. People update accounts. They adjust agreements. They consult attorneys about long-term planning." He paused. "What makes it worth looking at is the combination, the timing, the pattern of one person managing all of it, while the other person signs without fully understanding." He leaned back slightly. "That's not financial planning. That's financial positioning." "Positioning for what?" I asked. "For a future state he's already decided on," James said simply. "He told me he would start with what was publicly accessible property records, business filings, professional history, the kind of groundwork that didn't require anything beyond time and knowing where to look. He would move carefully," he said, "and he would tell me only what he could verify." 2 days later, he called. I took the call in my car, in the parking lot of a grocery store, because it felt like the right place to receive news I wasn't sure I was ready for. His voice was the same as it had been at the coffee shop, measured and unhurried, but there was something underneath it this time. "He has a separate account," James said. "Personal, not joint. It's been active for at least 14 months. The deposits don't correspond to anything on his disclosed income." A brief pause. "There may be others." I stared at a shopping cart someone had left in the middle of the parking lot, slightly crooked, catching the afternoon light. "How is that possible?" I asked. "Claire would have noticed." "Not necessarily," James said. "Not if she was never given reason to look, and not if her ability to notice things clearly has been gradually compromised." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "We need to find everything he's hiding," he said. "All of it, because what you've shown me so far is the surface, and in my experience, the surface is never the whole story." After we hung up, I drove home in a quiet that felt different from any quiet I had sat in over the past week. This was the quiet of something confirmed rather than something feared. Inside, I moved through the hallway without turning on the lights and stopped in front of the small console table near the living room entrance. There was a framed photograph there that had been sitting in that spot for years so long, I had stopped really seeing it. Claire and Marcus on their wedding day. She was laughing at something just out of frame. He was looking directly at the camera. I picked it up and looked at it the way I hadn't looked at it in a long time. His smile was perfect, positioned just right, warm enough to read, as genuine, controlled enough to be intentional. I had always thought it was simply the smile of a confident man on the happiest day of his life. Standing in my hallway on a Thursday evening, I understood for the first time that it had never been happiness at all. It had been certainty. Claire called Friday morning, and for once, her voice had a different quality to it. Not lighter exactly, but less guarded, the way a room feels when someone cracks a window after a long time of keeping everything closed. She had a follow-up appointment with a new physician. She had recently started seeing someone outside the practice Marcus had always managed for their family, and she asked if I might be able to come over and stay with Lily while she was gone. "A couple of hours," she said. "Nothing complicated." I said yes before she finished asking. It was the first time I had been in that house with just the two of them, my granddaughter and me, without the particular atmospheric pressure that arrived whenever Marcus was nearby. The difference was something I felt in my shoulders before I consciously registered it anywhere else. The air sat differently. The rooms seemed to breathe. Lily was at the kitchen table, working on a drawing, when I came in, her colored pencils arranged in a careful row beside her sketchbook. She looked up when she heard my voice and something moved across her face, quickly, the way a light flickers on and steadies. She smiled, a real one, not performed for anyone's benefit, and went back to her drawing. We spent the first half hour, the way you spend time, with a 9-year-old, when things are easy between you. She showed me her latest artwork, a detailed rendering of a horse standing in a field that was far better than anything I could have managed at twice her age. We made grilled cheese sandwiches and ate them at the kitchen counter because she said the stools were more fun than the chairs. She told me about a book she was reading and summarized 3 chapters with the kind of passionate detail that made me wish I had her enthusiasm for everything. She was a remarkable child. She always had been. But that afternoon, I noticed something else underneath all that brightness, something careful and watchful that didn't quite belong on a face so young. After lunch, she was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. She set her pencil down and looked at the table. Then she pushed back her stool and said simply, "Can I show you something?" "Of course," I said. She led me down the hallway to her bedroom without another word. It was a cheerful room, the kind of space a child makes fully her own posters on the walls and stuffed animals arranged with personal logic on the bookshelf. She walked to her bed and crouched down, reaching beneath it with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times before. She pulled out a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that children use for school. She held it for just a moment, both hands around it, and then she turned and offered it to me, without meeting my eyes. I took it carefully, the way you take something you understand to be fragile. She sat on the edge of her bed. I sat in the small chair at her desk, and I opened it. The handwriting on the first page was uneven and looping the handwriting of a child who was still making friends with cursive. She had written a date at the top of the entry 6 months ago, and underneath it, in careful, deliberate sentences, she had written down what she saw. Daddy told Mommy she forgot to call the dentist again. Mommy looked confused. I heard Mommy call them last week. I turned the page. Mommy couldn't find her keys this morning. Daddy found them in the refrigerator. He showed everyone at breakfast. Mommy said she didn't remember putting them there. I don't think she did put them there. Another page. Daddy said Mommy has been having a hard time lately. He said it at dinner in front of the Hendersons. Mommy got very quiet. She didn't finish eating. I read slowly, turning each page, the way you turn pages when you are afraid of what the next one might say, and cannot stop yourself from looking anyway. Entry after entry, date after date. A 9-year-old's faithful record of a household being quietly rearranged around a false story. She had written down the exact words she heard, the precise moments, the small surgical incidents that taken individually could be explained away as nothing but gathered here in her careful handwriting, assembled into something that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. I was near the back of the notebook when I found it. The entry was dated about 3 weeks earlier. The handwriting was slightly less careful than the others, like it had been written quickly, or with more feeling than usual. Today, Daddy said Mommy forgot again. But I saw Mommy remember. She just didn't say anything. I think Mommy is scared. And then, on the line beneath it, smaller, like an afterthought, that was actually the most important thing. I don't know if this helps, but I wrote it all down just in case. I closed the notebook. I don't know how long I sat there before I looked up. Lily was watching me from the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, her face very still. She looked the way children look when they have been carrying something adult-sized for a very long time and are not sure if handing it over was the right decision. I went to her. I sat beside her on the bed, and I put my arms around her, and she leaned into me immediately, without hesitation, the way children lean into safety when they finally find it. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. Outside the window, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it always did. The same trimmed lawns, the same matching mailboxes, the same quiet, orderly street where nothing was supposed to go wrong. And inside this room, a little girl had been keeping the truth alive the only way she knew how. 1 page at a time. My phone rang at 6:47 that evening. I recognized the number, but not the quality of silence, before James spoke. There was a fraction of a second between the call connecting and his voice coming through that told me before a single word that whatever he had found was not small. "Are you home?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Can you come to my office?" A pause, brief and deliberate. "Tonight, if possible." James worked out of a small office suite on the second floor of a building on Capitol Avenue, the kind of address that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A single frosted glass door, a waiting area with 2 chairs that no one ever seemed to use, and beyond that, a workspace that was orderly in the particular way of someone who thinks better when everything has a place. He was at his desk when I arrived, a single lamp burning on the corner, the rest of the room settling into shadow. His monitor cast a pale light across his face. He stood when I came in, gestured to the chair across from him, and waited until I was seated before he said anything. "I want to walk you through this slowly," he said, "because I need you to understand not just what it says, but what it means." He turned the monitor toward me. What I was looking at appeared at first glance to be an ordinary document. A simple table, columns, and rows, the kind of organizational structure you might use for a project schedule or a budget breakdown. Clean, efficient, professional. But the column headers were not what you would find in any ordinary planning document. The first column was labeled Date. The second, Action. The third, Expected Response. The fourth, Next Step. And the entries began 2 years ago. James let me read in silence. He did not explain or interpret. He simply watched my face as I moved down the first page, and I understood that he had done this before, shown people things that rearranged their understanding of their own lives, and he knew that the only thing to do was give a person time to take it in. The early entries were clinical in their precision. Dosage adjustments noted alongside projected timelines. Specific phrases to introduce into conversation, words like overwhelmed and confused, and not herself lately, with checkboxes beside each one, as though they were items on a to-do list. Suggested situations in which to reference her memory difficulties in front of others. I had to stop reading for a moment. I looked at the far wall of his office and breathed steadily until the ringing in my ears subsided. Then I looked back at the screen. The middle section of the document shifted to financial matters, property refinancing, account restructuring, the sequential transfer of assets from jointly held positions into arrangements that would, by their final configuration, leave one person with everything and the other with significantly less than she believed she had. Each step was mapped with the kind of specificity that required not just intent, but research, legal research, financial research, the kind you commissioned from professionals who asked no questions. Further down, a section labeled simply Documentation. This was where the cognitive evaluation appeared. Not as a medical recommendation, not as an expression of concern for a struggling spouse, but as a scheduled event in a sequence. A box to be checked, a piece of paper to be obtained and filed, positioned in the timeline between the final account transfers and the last column entry. I scrolled to the bottom. The final entry was formatted differently from the rest. Larger font, set apart from the rows above it, the way a conclusion is set apart from the argument that precedes it. Final step, submit evaluation results. Estimated timeline to full asset transfer, 3 weeks. The room was very quiet. I became aware of the hum of the building's ventilation system, a sound I had not noticed until everything else seemed to fall away. I became aware of my own breathing, of the lamp on the corner of James's desk, and the small circle of yellow light it threw across the surface. I looked at the clock on his wall, 7:23 in the evening. 3 weeks from now, if this document reflected what was actually in motion, the shape of my daughter's life would be unrecognizable to her. Not because of anything dramatic or sudden, because of something that had been assembled, piece by careful piece, over the course of 2 years, by a man who had sat across from her every morning at breakfast and said goodnight to her every evening, and had been doing this the entire time. "How did you find this?" I asked, My voice came out steadier than I expected. Carefully, James said. And legally. He folded his hands on the desk. The more important question right now is what you're going to do with it. I looked at the clock again, then back at the screen, then at James, who was watching me with the patient expression of a man who had learned a long time ago that he could not make decisions for the people who came to sit across from his desk. He could only show them what was true. How much time do we actually have? I asked. He glanced at the document. Less than you'd like, he said. More than you'd think, but not much more. I picked up my bag from the floor beside the chair and held it in my lap for a moment, grounding myself in something solid and ordinary. 3 weeks. The words settled into my chest like a stone into still water. Whatever I was going to do, I was going to have to do it now. That same night, I couldn't sleep. By 7 the next morning, I was already in my car. I had sent Claire a message just after 6, keeping it simple, telling her I wanted to stop by before Marcus left for his rounds, if she was up. She replied within minutes, which told me she hadn't been sleeping well either. Come whenever she wrote. He leaves at 7:30. I timed it so that I pulled into her driveway at 7:45. I sat for a moment, watching the street, making sure his car was gone. It was. The driveway held only Claire's sedan. Slightly dusty, parked at an angle that suggested she hadn't moved it in several days. She opened the door before I knocked. She was in a cardigan and slippers, her hair pulled back, no performance of being put together this morning. Just Claire. And somehow, that small thing, the absence of all that careful presentation, felt like the first honest thing I had seen from her in a long time. Come in, she said quietly. Lily's already at school. We sat at the kitchen table. She had made coffee 2 mugs and pushed one toward me without asking. I wrapped both hands around it and looked at my daughter and understood with a clarity that came from somewhere very old in me that there was no gentle way to do what I was about to do. There was only honest and dishonest. I need to tell you some things, I said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond. Can you do that? She studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded. I started at the beginning. The Sunday dinner, the overheard phone call, the recording I had made without planning to. I watched her face carefully as I described what I had heard. She went very still, the way a person goes still, when something they half knew is being spoken out loud for the first time. Then I told her about the medication, about Sandra, who I described only as a trusted professional with direct knowledge of her prescription history and what that history showed. I did not use clinical language. I simply told her what it meant in plain terms, that the dosage had been increased in a pattern that affected memory and clarity of thought over time. Something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. The particular recognition of someone being handed the explanation for something they have been trying to understand for a long time. I kept going. I told her about the document James had found. I didn't describe every line. I told her what it was, a plan written down 2 years old, organized like a schedule with her life as the subject matter. I told her what the final entry said. When I finished, the kitchen was completely quiet. Claire had not moved. Her coffee sat untouched in front of her. She was looking at the surface of the table, and I could see the muscles in her jaw, working slowly, steadily, the way they do when someone is trying very hard to hold something together from the inside. Claire, I said softly. She looked up. Say whatever you need to say, I told her. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said something I had not expected. I know, she said. I mean, I didn't know, but I knew. She pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly and took a breath. There are mornings, she said slowly, where I wake up and everything is clear, like genuinely, completely clear. I know what day it is. I remember things I haven't thought about in weeks. I feel like myself. She paused. And then, by afternoon, it's like someone turned a dimmer switch. Everything goes soft. I stop trusting what I remember. She looked at her hands on the table. I thought it was me. I thought the anxiety was real. And the medication was helping, and the fog was just something I had to manage. Her voice was very quiet. He was so patient about it. Every time I struggled, he was right there, explaining, reassuring. I thought I was lucky. She stopped. I waited. About 6 weeks ago, she said carefully, I started doing something. I don't know exactly why. I didn't have a reason I could have explained. At the time, it was more like a feeling. She glanced at me briefly, then back at her hands. I started keeping some of the pills, not taking all of them. I'd take some and set the rest aside, and I never said anything about it. She exhaled slowly. I just stopped taking the full amount. The kitchen felt very still around those words. And the mornings got clearer, I said. The mornings got clearer, she confirmed. We sat with that for a while. We sat with it for a long time, actually. Long enough for the coffee to go cold and for the light in the kitchen to shift from the pale, early quality of morning to something warmer and more settled. We talked in the way that you talk, when there is too much to say, and no efficient path through any of it, circling and returning, and sometimes just sitting in silence, because silence was also part of it, though parts had. At some point I realized 2 hours had passed. Claire had cried twice briefly, and then collected herself both times, with a quiet efficiency that reminded me of the woman she had always been, before all of this, capable and grounded and clear-eyed in ways she had been slowly talked out of, believing about herself. When she finally looked at me across the table, her eyes were red at the edges, but steady. She looked like my daughter, not the version of her I had been watching for months. That careful, diminished apologizing for everything woman who moved through her own house, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. This was the woman underneath all of that, present, real, fully inhabiting herself for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to calculate. What do we do? She asked. And for the first time since the Sunday, I had stood in that hallway with my hand pressed against the wall. I had an answer. The next morning, I called Patricia before 8. By noon, my dining room table had disappeared under a layer of legal pads, printed records, and 3 laptops belonging to people who had each in their own way decided that what was happening to my daughter was worth their time and their expertise. 3 weeks. That number had settled into everything. Now, not as a deadline, but as a dimension, the way a room changes when you learn its actual size. You stop treating it as infinite. You start making decisions. Patricia arrived first, the way she always did, punctual to the point of seeming to materialize, rather than travel. She set her bag on the chair at the head of the table and began laying out documents with the systematic efficiency of someone who had spent decades turning complicated situations into manageable ones. She was the kind of attorney who didn't raise her voice because she never needed to. James came 20 minutes later, nodded to the room, poured himself a coffee from the pot I had set out, and opened his laptop without ceremony. He had been working since early that morning, he told me, and there were additional financial records he wanted to walk us through before the end of the day. Sandra, the pharmacist, who had first identified the pattern in the prescription records, joined us by telephone, her voice coming through the speaker at the center of the table with the careful precision she brought to everything. She had prepared a formal written summary of her findings documented in language that would hold up to professional scrutiny, and she walked us through it point by point. Claire sat across from me. She had driven over alone, which was itself a small act of reclamation. For months, she had moved through her days in a way that was managed and supervised and accounted for. Coming to her mother's house on a Sunday morning without explanation or permission was in the economy of her current life a significant thing. She didn't say that. She didn't need to. She was quieter than the others during the first hour, listening more than speaking, absorbing the shape of what had been assembled on her behalf. But she was present in a way that was different from the Claire I had watched across tables and living rooms over the past several months. There was no apology in her posture, no reflexive glance toward the door. When James finished walking through the financial records, she asked 2 questions. Both were precise. Both were exactly the right questions. Patricia looked at her briefly over the top of her reading glasses and said nothing, but I saw something register in her expression. a quiet reassessment. In the days that followed, each person moved through their piece of it with focused purpose. Patricia built her legal framework carefully, layering each document into a structure designed to be both comprehensive and swift when the time came to act. She called it positioning, the same word James had used weeks ago. But in her hands, it meant something different. It meant being so thoroughly prepared that the other side had no room to maneuver. James continued pulling financial threads, each one leading to another. The full picture, emerging the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly, then all at once. Meanwhile, Claire went home each evening and moved through her household in the ordinary way, making dinner, helping with homework, going to bed at the usual hour. But in the quiet margins of those days, she was doing something else. In the hours when she was alone, she went through the filing cabinet in the home office, the one she had stopped having regular access to, and she carefully photographed every document she could find. Insurance policies, property records, account statements going back 3 years. She sent them to me each evening from a separate account she had set up using her work computer during a break. She told me later that it felt strange, at first, moving through her own home, that way collecting pieces of her own life like evidence. And then it stopped feeling strange and started feeling necessary. And then slowly, it started feeling like something else entirely. It started feeling like agency. On the 4th day, I was in my kitchen when my phone buzzed with a message from her. No words, just a photograph of a document, a property assessment update, with both their names at the top, that she had found tucked into a folder she had never been shown. I forwarded it to Patricia immediately. Lily, through all of this, knew nothing of what was in motion. She went to school and came home and did her homework and drew her horses and talked about her book and ate dinner beside a mother who was day by day, and in ways too subtle for a child to measure, becoming more herself again. On Thursday evening, I stopped by to drop off something Claire had left at my place, and I found Lily at the kitchen table with her composition book open. She was writing, not the careful, watchful entries I had read in her bedroom, something different. Her pencil moved quickly, loosely, with the unguarded energy of someone who was not recording facts, but telling a story. When she heard me come in, she looked up, and there was an ease in her face that I had not seen there in a long time. "What are you working on?" I asked. "A story," she said, "about a girl who figures something out." She said it simply, the way children say things that contain more than they know. The night before Patricia planned to file, we gathered at my house one final time. It was brief, purposeful. Each person confirmed what they had prepared, what they could verify, what would hold. When it was done, Patricia looked at Claire directly. "We move before he does," she said. "Once we file, the other side will respond. Things will move quickly." She paused. "Are you ready for that?" The kitchen was quiet. Claire looked down at the table for just a moment. I watched her the way I had been watching her for weeks now, looking for the hesitation, the reflexive retreat, the apology that would arrive before the answer. It didn't come. She raised her eyes and looked back at Patricia with an expression I had not seen on her face in longer than I could say. Not bravado, not performance, just the quiet, clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who had made her decision and was no longer afraid of it. "When this breaks," Patricia said quietly, "it will break fast." "I know," Claire said, and she meant it. Patricia had scheduled the filing for 9 o'clock Monday morning. That was the thought I went to sleep with Sunday night, and the thought I woke with 3 hours later when something pulled me out of a shallow dream I couldn't remember. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, counting the hours, the way you count them, when sleep has already decided it's done with you for the night. 11 hours. That was all that stood between where we were and where we needed to be. My phone lit up at 9:47. I saw Claire's name and sat up before I was fully awake. She never called this late on a Sunday. That was the first thing. The second thing was the quality of the silence. When I answered, that particular held breath stillness that tells you someone is managing their voice very carefully. "Mom." Just the one word, and I already knew. "What happened?" I asked, He came home early, she said. He has papers. I was already standing, she told me quickly, in the low, measured tone of someone speaking from a room where they could be heard, that Marcus had arrived home just after 9 with a folder of documents he said needed to be taken care of before the week started. He had been calm about it, she said, organized, the way he always was when he had already decided how something was going to go. He had laid everything out on the kitchen table with the practiced ease of a man presenting something reasonable, something routine. And he had begun explaining it the same way he had explained every other document over the past 2 years, in that smooth, unhurried voice that made everything sound like common sense. But this time, Claire had asked a question, not a general question, a specific one. She had pointed to a particular clause and asked him plainly what it meant for the property title, and whether it changed her individual access to the joint account. I heard her describe the moment his expression shifted, and I recognized it without having seen it. That fractional pause, the recalibration behind the eyes of someone who has been met with an unexpected variable. He had answered, but the answer hadn't addressed the question. She had asked again. He told me I was overcomplicating it, she said quietly, that I didn't need to worry about the details, that he had taken care of everything, and all I needed to do was sign. And when you didn't, I asked. A brief pause. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort in it. He said I'd been doing that a lot lately, getting confused about simple things and then deciding they were complicated. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, and then he said it, she told me. He said I needed to stop letting my anxiety drive the conversation, that I knew how I got when I didn't take care of myself. The words landed in the particular way that words land when you have been waiting for them, when you have been told by people you trust that they were coming, and you believed them, but still hoped in some small place that they wouldn't. He used to say it like he was concerned, Claire said. Tonight, it wasn't like that. I know, I said. It was like he was tired of pretending to be concerned, she said. I walked to the entryway and took my keys from the hook by the door without deciding to. My hand simply moved there, the way hands move toward things they know need to happen. Where is he now? I asked. In the kitchen, she said, waiting for me to come back. Are you somewhere he can't hear you? Yes. A pause. I told him I needed a glass of water. Okay, I said. Listen to me carefully. I kept my voice even. I told her not to go back and sign anything. I told her to take her time, that she had every right to take her time, and that if he pressed her, she could tell him she needed until morning to review it. I told her she had done nothing wrong by asking questions. I told her that asking questions was exactly right. She was quiet for a moment. Mom, she said. Her voice had dropped even lower, the particular register of someone who has just heard a sound they weren't expecting. He's coming down the hallway. I hear you, I said. He has the papers in his hand. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to change everything. Mom, he's here. I had my keys. I had my coat from the hook beside the door. I was already moving toward the garage before she finished the sentence, and the only thought in my head was the one that had been there since a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks ago, when I had stood in a hallway very much like this one, and understood for the first time that understanding something was not the same as doing something about it. Tonight was the doing. 15 minutes felt like 2 different things at once. Too long when you were sitting in a car, on a dark residential street, watching every lit window of a house you couldn't yet enter. Too short when you were trying to decide, in the space between one traffic light and the next, exactly how you were going to walk through a door and dismantle something a very careful man had spent 2 years building. I pulled into the driveway at 10:10. The porch light was on. The rest of the house was lit the way houses are lit when people are awake and not speaking to each other. I walked up the front path and rang the bell and stood in the yellow light with my bag over my shoulder and my phone in my coat pocket and waited. He opened the door. Marcus looked at me the way he always looked at me, with that particular warmth that arrived exactly on cue calibrated to the precise degree required for the situation. A pleasant surprise, a welcome inconvenience, the smile of a man who had never once been caught off guard. "Ruth," he said. First time he had used my actual name in 6 years. "Marcus," I said. "I'd like to come in." A fraction of a pause. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider, and I walked past him into the house. Claire was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had positioned herself there. I understood immediately so that she could see both the front entrance and the room behind her at the same time. She met my eyes briefly. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. Marcus closed the front door and turned. The folder of documents was still on the kitchen table where he had left it, spread out with that deliberate orderliness that was, I now understood, a form of theater as much as anything else. "I didn't realize you were coming by," he said pleasantly. "I didn't either until recently," I said. We moved into the living room because that was the natural movement, and none of us acknowledged the strangeness of it. He sat in the armchair nearest the window. Claire sat on the near end of the sofa. I remained standing for a moment, then chose the chair across from him. "I'd like to talk about those documents," I said. He glanced at Claire briefly, then back at me. "Ruth, I appreciate your concern, but this is really something between Claire and me. A family matter." "It is a family matter," I agreed. "That's why I'm here." He smiled. Still patient, still unbothered. The performance was flawless, and I had spent long enough watching it to know that the only way to interrupt it was to give it something it hadn't rehearsed for. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. "I want to play you something," I said, "from about 3 weeks ago." The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it shifted, a barely perceptible adjustment, the way a light flickers when the power dips for less than a second. I pressed play. His own voice came out of the speaker, Gitzel's low and unhurried, exactly as I had heard it, standing in a hallway with my back against the wall. The words were clear. "She signed off on the first set of documents last month. Didn't even read them. That's the thing about trust. Once you have it, you can do almost anything with it." I let it finish. The room was very quiet. "That could mean any number of things," Marcus said. His voice had not changed. "That was the most unsettling part. You've taken something out of context and constructed a narrative around it." I reached into my bag again and set a printed document on the coffee table between us. He looked at it. I watched him look at it. It was a single sheet, the cover page of James's printed file, with the title and the date in the first 3 entries of the 2-year timeline, visible without having to turn a page. I had chosen that page deliberately because it contained the date the plan had begun, which was 14 months before Claire had reported her first episode of confusion. He was still looking at it when Claire stood up. She didn't stand the way people stand when they are frightened. She stood the way people stand when they have decided something. Fully upright shoulders, back both feet on the floor. "I know about the prescription," she said. Her voice was quiet and perfectly steady. "I know what it does, and I know how long it's been adjusted, and I know that I didn't need it." For the first time since I had known him, Marcus had nothing ready. He looked at her in a way I had never seen him look at her before, not with the patient, slightly condescending warmth he usually directed at her, not with the controlled frustration he deployed when she didn't cooperate. Something else moved across his face, fast and unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. But I saw it, and Claire saw it. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. His voice had changed. Not loud, quieter, if anything. But the quality had shifted entirely. The warmth stripped away to reveal something harder underneath something that had always been there and had simply been covered over until now. Claire looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Actually," she said, "I do." A pause, clean and deliberate. "For the first time in 2 years, I do." The silence that followed had a different texture from any silence that had come before it in that room. It was not the silence of something unresolved. It was the silence of something ending. And then from somewhere above us came the sound of a footstep. Small, careful. The particular sound of someone who has been very still for a very long time and has just shifted their weight. No one moved. No one looked at the ceiling. We all simply became aware, in the same moment, that someone had been standing at the top of the stairs and had heard everything. She was standing at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, both hands wrapped around the spine of a black and white marbled notebook, holding it the way you hold something you have decided to give away, even though giving it away costs you something. Her feet were bare on the hardwood landing. Her hair was slightly flattened on one side from the pillow, which told me she had been in bed when the voices started, and had gotten up not because she was called, but because something in her understood that tonight was different from other nights. She looked down at the three of us in the living room below. She did not look at her father. She looked at me. I moved to the bottom of the stairs. I didn't say anything. I simply held out my hand the way you hold out your hand to someone who has been waiting for a safe place to put something down. She came down one step at a time, slowly, her eyes on mine the entire way. When she reached the bottom, she placed the notebook in my hands with a care and a deliberateness that no 9-year-old should have to possess. Then she stepped to the side and stood very still. The room was completely silent. Marcus had not moved from where he stood near the far wall. I did not look at him. I looked at the notebook in my hands, at the familiar black and white cover, and I opened it to the first page. The date at the top was 10 months ago. I read slowly, the way I had read it the first time, in Lily's bedroom on a Friday afternoon when the only sound was the neighborhood outside the window. But reading it here in this room with these people present was entirely different. Each entry landed differently. Each carefully written line, each date, each exact and faithful record of what this child had witnessed carried a weight in this space that it had not carried in the quiet of her bedroom. I turned the pages one by one. The entries came in sequence, month after month, a child's meticulous accounting of a household being quietly rearranged, the specific words used at dinner, the moments of confusion that were announced to others before they were even fully formed, the small surgical incidents that heard from the mouth of a 9-year-old. Writing them down in her careful, uneven hand could not be mistaken for anything other than what they were. Claire made a sound beside me, not a word, something smaller than a word. The sound a person makes when something they have been trying not to fully believe becomes impossible not to believe anymore. She crossed the room in 3 steps and gathered Lily into her arms, pulling her daughter close with a fierceness that had nothing rehearsed about it. Lily pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and held on with both hands. Neither of them spoke. I kept reading. I was near the end of the notebook when I heard Marcus shift his weight. I did not stop. I turned the last written page and found the entry I had read once before, the one with the slightly looser handwriting, the one that had been written faster or with more feeling than the others. I read it aloud. Not loudly, just clearly. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but I wrote it all down because someone has to remember the truth when everyone else forgets. The words settled into the room the way certain words do completely, without leaving space for anything else. I closed the notebook. I heard him first, before I saw him move. The sound of his shoe on the hardwood floor, one step, then another, moving toward the front of the house. I looked up. He had turned away from us and was walking toward the entryway with the particular, controlled purpose of a man who has made a decision and is not going to discuss it. He stopped at the door. His hand was on the handle. His back was to the room. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. I watched the set of his shoulders, the way they held, the way they didn't quite hold. Whatever was happening in him in those few seconds, whatever reckoning was taking place beneath that careful exterior, he kept it entirely to himself. He always had. That was the one thing about him that was absolutely consistent. He turned his head, not all the way, just enough to take in the room from the edge of his peripheral vision. Claire standing with Lily in her arms, me with the notebook closed in my hands. The 3 of us in the warm light of a living room that was his and was no longer his. He didn't say anything. He opened the door. He walked out. The latch clicked shut behind him with a sound that was surprisingly small for everything it meant. I set the notebook down on the side table and listened. The sound of a car engine starting. The sound of tires on the driveway. The sound of those things fading down the street until they were indistinguishable from the ordinary nighttime quiet of the neighborhood. Claire raised her head from Lily's hair. She looked at me across the room with an expression that contained too many things to name relief and grief and exhaustion, and something that was not quite either of those, but lived somewhere near all of them. I looked back at her and didn't try to name any of it either. Some things don't need to be named. They just need to be witnessed. And this time, he didn't come back. The sun came up anyway. That was the first thing I noticed, lying on the guest room bed where I had stayed the night, still in my clothes, from the evening before. The light came through the curtains the same way it always did, indifferent to everything that had happened in the hours before it arrived. And the birds outside started their morning conversation with the complete unconcern of creatures who had not been awake at 10 o'clock the night before, watching a man walk out of his own house. The world had continued. That was almost surprising. I lay still for a moment, listening to the house around me. It was a different kind of listening than any I had done in weeks. Not the tense, searching attention of someone waiting for a sound that would confirm a fear. Something quieter than that. More like the listening you do when you have been in a loud place for a very long time and have finally stepped outside. The house was still, not empty, just still. I found Claire in the kitchen at 7:30. She was standing at the counter in the early light, measuring coffee into the filter with the unhurried focus of someone who was doing an ordinary thing and finding perhaps for the first time in a long time that ordinary things were available to her again. She heard me come in and looked up. We didn't say good morning the way you say it when everything is fine. We said it the way you say it when everything has changed, and fine is somewhere further down the road, and that's acceptable. She poured water into the machine and pressed the button and turned around. Her hands were steady. I noticed that the way you notice something small that means something large, not trembling slightly the way they had at every kitchen table conversation over the past several weeks. Not wrapped around a mug for something to hold on to, just resting at her sides, easy, belonging to a person who was standing in her own kitchen on a Monday morning without bracing herself against anything. She noticed me noticing. "I know," she said quietly. A small, real smile. My phone rang at 8:05. Patricia's voice was crisp and focused, the voice she used when she had already been working for an hour before most people were awake. "We filed," she said. 20 minutes ago. Everything went through clean. I stepped into the hallway to talk, keeping my voice low, and she walked me through the essential points, briefly and clearly. The filings were in. The financial protections were in place. There were steps ahead. She said things that would require time and patience, and probably some difficult days. But the groundwork was laid, and it was solid. "She's going to be all right," Patricia said. Not as a comfort, as an assessment. "Yes," I said. "She is." When I came back to the kitchen, Lily was at the table. She had appeared the way children appear, in the morning, suddenly and fully, already dressed for school. Her backpack, propped against the chair beside her. She had poured herself a glass of orange juice and was working through a bowl of cereal with the focused efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be. She looked up when I came in and smiled at me, with the uncomplicated ease of a child who had slept well. "Morning, Grandma," she said. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said. And then, without any particular preamble, she began telling us about something that had happened at school on Friday. A project about the California missions that her class was starting, and a disagreement she'd had with her best friend about which mission was the most interesting to research, and her own very firm opinion on the matter, delivered with the confident particularity of someone who had thought it through. Claire stood at the counter, listening, coffee mug in hand now, and she was smiling. Not the careful, managed smile I had watched her produce 100 times over the past months. A real one. The kind that arrives without being summoned, that lives in the eyes, as much as the mouth, that belongs to a person who is fully present in the room they are standing in. I sat down at the table across from Lily and listened to the California missions debate, and I thought about all the mornings in this kitchen over the past 2 years that had not felt like this. All the mornings waited with something unspoken. All the careful performances of ordinary life. This was not a performance. This was just breakfast. That distinction, small as it sounds, was everything. After Lily left for school, the house settled into a quiet that had a different quality from the quiet of the night before. The night before had been the quiet of aftermath. This was the quiet of a morning that belonged to the people in it. Claire stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. The light was coming through at the low angle it gets in early fall, turning everything it touched a pale, clean gold. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said without turning around, "I forgot what quiet felt like. I waited. Not the kind that meant something was wrong," she said. "Not the kind where you're always listening for what's coming next." She paused. Just quiet. The words settled between us, simple and complete. My phone buzzed on the table. Patricia again, a follow-up message about the next steps, dates, and appointments, and the particular vocabulary of a process that was only just beginning. I looked at the message and then at Claire at the window, and I understood something clearly. The hardest night was behind us. The road ahead was long and would ask things of both of us that we couldn't fully anticipate yet. There would be difficult days in the weeks and months to come, legal proceedings and practical reckonings, and the slower, quieter work of rebuilding a life that had been quietly taken apart. But she would not be walking that road the way she had walked the last 2 years. She would not be walking it alone. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks I could remember. Not faster exactly, and not slower. More like the way time moves when you have been holding your breath for a very long time and have finally been allowed to exhale. Everything that happened seemed to happen with a kind of inevitability, one thing leading cleanly to the next, as though the truth had simply been waiting for enough room to arrange itself. Patricia's filings set things in motion, the way a stone sets water in motion. You drop it in, and the rings move outward in every direction, quietly, steadily reaching places you didn't expect them to reach. The financial picture emerged first. James had been thorough, and what his work had uncovered over the previous weeks became in the hands of the attorneys and the institutions involved a detailed and documented account of money moved in ways that could not be adequately explained. Accounts that had no reason to exist, transfers with no corresponding purpose, assets repositioned through arrangements that had been constructed piece by piece over more than a year. The picture that emerged was not of a man who had made poor financial decisions. It was of a man who had made very deliberate ones. The professional review came next. Sandra had prepared her documentation with the same precision she brought to everything, a clear and factual account of the prescription history, the dosage, progression, the timeline, and what that timeline indicated to a qualified professional. She submitted it formally, as she had always intended to do if it came to that, to the appropriate medical oversight body. These things move slowly, by design, but they move. Word travels in hospitals, the way word travels in any community where people work closely together over long periods of time. Quietly at first, in the particular careful way that people discuss things they are not certain about, but cannot entirely set aside. Then less quietly, then not quietly at all. Colleagues who had known Marcus for years began to look back at things they thought they understood and find that the understanding no longer held. Small moments, offhand comments, things they had attributed to personality or stress, or the ordinary friction of a demanding career, rearranged themselves into a different shape when seen in the new light of what was becoming known. The image he had built so carefully, that composed dependable, well-regarded professional who coached youth soccer on weekends and always remembered names, began to develop cracks. Not all at once. The way most things built on an unsteady foundation develop cracks gradually, and then in ways that couldn't be ignored. Claire was not in the hospital during this period. She had taken a leave of absence in the days following that Sunday night, something Patricia had advised and her supervisors had granted without question. She did not have to watch it happen in real time. She heard about it in pieces from me and from Patricia in the careful, measured way that we had all learned to deliver difficult information. Each time I told her something new, I watched her face. Not for distress, though there was sometimes distress. Mostly, I watched for the thing underneath the distress, that quiet, grounded clarity that had been returning to her in increments since she had stopped allowing her system to be managed by someone else. It was there every time, steadier each week. The house itself was going through its own process. Patricia had ensured that Claire's access to the property was protected immediately, and the practical question of what would happen to it was somewhere in the longer road ahead. But it was her house to be in, and she was in it, and that mattered in ways that were hard to articulate, but easy to feel when you walked through the door. Lily seemed lighter. That was the word that kept coming to me when I saw her. Lighter. The careful watchfulness she had carried for so long began to ease, not disappearing overnight, but releasing gradually, the way a child releases something. When they finally understand, they no longer have to carry it. She laughed more. She argued more, which is the right kind of sign in a 9-year-old. She went back to her drawing and her stories with the unselfconscious absorption of a child who is simply being a child. One evening in the 3rd week, I was sitting in my kitchen when my phone rang. "James." "Ruth," he said. The same measured voice, the same economy of words, but something in the quality of it was different from every other call he had made to me over the past several weeks. Lighter in the same way Lily was lighter. "The legal part is done." I held the phone. "She's protected," he said. "Financially, legally. What comes next is process and time, but the part that required urgency is finished. He can't touch what's hers." He paused. "Now it's her turn," he said quietly. "The rest of it is hers to do." I said thank you. I meant it more completely than I had meant those words in a long time. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat in the chair where I had sat so many evenings over the past weeks, in the same kitchen where I had listened to 43 seconds of audio that had started all of this. And for the first time since that Sunday afternoon, I cried. Not the careful, controlled kind of not crying I had been practicing for weeks, holding everything steady for Claire, for Lily, for the work that needed doing. This was something else, the kind of release that only comes when the thing you have been bracing against is finally truly over, and your body understands it before your mind quite catches up. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet of an ordinary evening, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had been lifted. It wasn't sadness. It was the particular and profound relief of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had just been given permission to stop. No one tells you that coming back to yourself takes time. I think I expected it to happen the way the rest of it had, fast and all at once. I expected Claire to wake up one morning, look in the mirror, and just be herself again, the way she used to be, laughing too loud at her own jokes, stealing the last piece of pie, without asking, calling me on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all, except that she felt like talking. But that's not how it worked. The new doctor, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Okafor, who practiced out of a quiet office on a tree-lined street in Midtown, explained it to us both during the first appointment. She said the process of stepping down from the medication had to be slow, deliberate. The body needed time to remember how to regulate itself. The mind needed even longer. So that's what we did. We gave it time. The first 2 weeks, Claire said, she felt like she was moving through water. Not the heavy, murky kind, she'd grown used to this, was different. Cleaner, like the water was slowly draining away, and she was beginning to feel the ground beneath her feet again. By the 3rd week, she called me on a Wednesday morning, and I could hear it before she even said a word. Something in the way she breathed, something in the small half-laugh she gave before she spoke. "Mom," she said, "I remembered where I put Lily's school permission slip. I remembered it before I even looked for it. I just knew." It doesn't sound like much, but I sat down right there in my kitchen and pressed my hand flat against the table to steady myself. That's how the morning started going. Small things then, bigger things. Her own birthday, the name of the street where she grew up, the way she used to take her coffee, 2 sugars, a little cream, stirred 3 times. Things she had stopped trusting herself to remember. Things she had started believing she'd simply lost. She hadn't lost them. They'd been buried. And now slowly they were surfacing. One afternoon in late October, Claire came over while Lily was at school. We sat at my kitchen table, the way we used to when she was in her 20s, 2 cups of tea, nowhere to be nothing, to perform. And she started talking. Not about the legal filings. Not about what came next. She talked about before. She told me about a Tuesday evening, maybe 18 months ago, when she'd found a bank statement she didn't recognize tucked between 2 cookbooks on the kitchen shelf. She said she'd held it in her hands, read it 3 times, and known clearly, completely known that something was wrong. She'd even started to reach for her phone, and then she'd stopped. He walked into the kitchen, she said, and he looked at me the way he always did when I asked questions. Not angry, just tired, like I was the problem he had been patiently managing all day. She turned her cup in her hands, and I put the statement back. I told myself I must have misread it, that I was being paranoid again. She told me about the prescriptions she'd quietly started setting aside, how she'd been tucking 1 pill a day into a folded piece of paper towel at the back of her nightstand drawer for almost 2 months before that night in the hallway. Not because she had a plan. She didn't have a plan. She just knew in the clearest part of her mind that something in her was being made smaller, and some stubborn, quiet piece of her had refused to disappear entirely. She had been fighting. The whole time, in the only way she could, she had been fighting. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at my daughter sitting across from me, her eyes clear and steady, her hands wrapped around her cup, and I thought about all the times I had worried that I hadn't gotten there soon enough. All the times I had replayed that Sunday afternoon and wondered what would have happened if I had left my phone at home. She hadn't been waiting to be rescued. She had been holding the door open from the inside, waiting for someone to push. Across town, Lily had quietly retired her composition notebook. She'd told Claire one evening, matter-of-factly, the way 9-year-olds deliver the most important news between bites of dinner, without looking up, that she didn't need to write down the sad things anymore. "I'm writing a story now," she said. "A real one, with a girl who figures everything out." Claire had looked at me over Lily's head. Neither of us said a word. Some weeks later, on a slow Saturday morning, Claire and I were sitting together on the couch when she went quiet in the middle of a sentence. She looked down at her hands. Then she said it softly, like she'd been carrying it for a long time and had only just found the right moment to set it down. There were days I thought the fog was just who I was now. I didn't know it was something being done to me. I reached over and took her hand. I held it the way I used to when she was small, and the world felt too big, and she needed to know that someone was right there beside her. I didn't let go. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October, and Sacramento was doing what it does best in autumn, turning everything gold. The light came in at a low angle, the kind that makes ordinary things look like they've been painted. Claire's backyard maple had dropped half its leaves overnight, and they lay scattered across the grass in loose, unhurried drifts. The air smelled the way October air always does in this part of California, dry and clean, with just enough of a chill to make you want to wrap both hands around a warm cup and stay exactly where you are. We were sitting on this back porch, the 3 of us. Claire had made tea. Lily was already off the steps before we'd even settled into our chairs. She spotted a leaf spinning down from the maple, one of those wide, 5-pointed ones that catch the air just right and seem to float longer than they should. Lily took off after it at full speed, arms out, sneakers slapping the grass, completely unconcerned with anything except catching it before it touched the ground. She didn't catch it. The leaf drifted sideways at the last second, and Lily threw her hands up in protest, spun around once, then immediately went after the next one. I heard Claire laugh, not the careful, measured kind of laugh I had grown used to over the past 2 years, the kind that came out just a half second late, like she'd had to check first whether it was all right to make noise. This was the other kind, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere low in her chest and didn't ask anyone's permission. I looked over at her. She was leaning forward in her chair, both hands wrapped around her mug, watching Lily with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it. It wasn't relief exactly. It wasn't even happiness exactly. It was something quieter than both of those things. It was the look of a woman who had found her way back to a room she thought she'd lost the key to and was standing in the doorway just taking it in. I didn't say anything. I just watched the two of them. Lily was narrating her own chase, now providing commentary for an audience that existed only in her imagination, the way children do when they forget adults are present. She announced that she had a strategy. She announced that the Leaf did not stand a chance. She was wrong on both counts and completely unbothered by it. I thought about the first Sunday I'd sat at their dinner table, pressing my unease down into my lap and telling myself I was imagining things. I thought about all the weeks that followed, the quiet gathering of evidence, the careful conversations, the long drive home from that coffee shop on J Street when I sat in a parking lot and asked myself what kind of woman I was going to be. I thought about a 9-year-old girl writing things down in secret because she needed someone to remember the truth. And here we were. The maple dropped another leaf, and Lily launched herself across the yard with complete and total commitment. I thought this is what it was all for. Not the legal filings, not the recordings, not any of the hard necessary things that had to happen first. It was for this, a little girl chasing leaves in her own backyard on a Saturday afternoon, laughing because nothing was stopping her. I set my mug down and let my eyes travel past the fence out to the street beyond the yard. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. The same trimmed hedges, the same clean driveways, the same houses sitting side by side in their careful rows, each one presenting its best face to the world. From out there, nothing had changed. But I knew now, what I hadn't known before, that the most important things never announce themselves from the outside. They don't live on the surface, in the paint color, or the well-kept lawn, or the kind of car sitting in the driveway. They live in the small moments that happen behind closed doors, in the spaces between what people say and what they mean, in a child's handwriting, on a lined page, in a mother's hand, reaching for a pill she set aside, because some deep and unquenchable part of her was not ready to disappear. The outside of things had never been the point. It had just been the place where I'd been looking. Claire reached over and refilled my cup without being asked. She didn't make a production of it. She just set the kettle back down, and returned her eyes to her daughter. The simple, unhurried ease of it, that small, ordinary act of care, was more than I could have put into words right then. I wrapped my hands round the warmth and watched Lily, finally, triumphantly, catch a leaf. She held it up over her head with both hands, like it was the most important thing she had ever done. Claire made a sound that was half laugh, half something I don't quite have a name for. The October light held, and I understood, sitting there, that the truth had always been the only thing worth protecting. Not appearances, not the version of a life designed to look perfect from the street. The real thing, messy, hard-won, and still here. It had been worth every single step it took to get there. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over in my mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, not to examine it, but just because you're not quite ready to put it down. And I think the reason I keep coming back to it is this: nothing about what happened to my daughter looked the way I thought it would. I had spent enough years in this world to believe I knew what trouble looked like when it walked through the door. I thought it announced itself. I thought it raised its voice. Left marks you could point to, gave you something clear and undeniable to hold up and say there. That is the thing. But that's not how it came for Claire. It came quietly. It came in the shape of a husband who always had a reasonable explanation. It came in small adjustments, one at a time, so gradual that by the time you stepped back to look at the whole picture. You couldn't quite remember what it had looked like before. It came dressed in concern, in patience, in the language of someone who only wanted to help. That's the thing about this kind of harm. It doesn't leave the kind of evidence you can see from the outside. It works on the inside, on a person's confidence, on her memory, on the quiet voice in her own head that tells her what is real and what isn't. By the time it's done enough damage, the person it's being done to has often stopped trusting that voice entirely. And that, more than anything else, is what I want you to take from this story. If something feels wrong, trust that. I don't mean the ordinary worry that comes and goes, the small anxieties of daily life. I mean the other kind, the kind that settles in somewhere below your ribs and doesn't move. The kind that wakes you up at 3 a.m, not with panic, but with a low, steady certainty that something is not right. The kind I felt standing in my daughter's kitchen, watching her apologize for things that weren't her fault, and thinking she is disappearing and nobody is saying anything. That feeling was not nothing. It was never nothing. I've lived long enough to believe that we are sometimes given knowledge we can't fully explain. A pull in a direction, a hesitation at the wrong moment that turns out to be the right one. I believe God speaks in those quiet places, not in thunder, not always in ways we can put into words, but in a persistent, gentle pressure that keeps saying, pay attention, don't look away. Someone you love needs you to stay present. I almost dismissed it. I almost told myself I was overreacting, seeing things that weren't there, being the kind of mother-in-law nobody wants to be. And if I had talked myself out of what I knew in my bones, I don't know where Claire and Lily would be right now. So if you are sitting somewhere tonight and you have that feeling about someone you love, about a situation that doesn't quite add up, about a child who has gone quieter than usual, please don't talk yourself out of it. You don't have to have proof. You don't have to be certain. You just have to be willing to look a little closer. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply to notice. The people who love us don't always ask for help out loud. Sometimes they ask in other ways, in the careful way they choose their words, in the things they don't say, in the eyes of a child who hands you a notebook without any explanation, because she has run out of other ways to tell you something is wrong. God puts people in our lives at exactly the right moment. I believe that with everything I have. I believe Patricia calling me that Thursday morning was not a coincidence. I believe James finding what he found when he found it was not luck. And I believe that the same quiet instinct that sent me back through that door for a forgotten phone, the one I almost didn't go back for, was something I was meant to follow. None of us got through this alone, and none of you have to either. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely, not as a formality. Have you ever had a feeling like that? The kind that didn't have an explanation, but turned out to be right. Maybe about someone in your own family. Maybe about a situation you couldn't quite name. Maybe you listened to it, and it changed something. Or maybe you didn't, and you've thought about it since. I'd love to hear your story. Leave it in the comments, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. You never know who else might read it and feel a little less alone tonight. And if this story stayed with you in any way, if something here felt familiar, or gave you something to think about, or reminded you of someone you love, I hope you'll consider passing it along. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right moment. Take care of the people around you. Pay attention to the quiet ones, and trust what you know, even when you can't yet explain it. I'll see you in the next one.